Folks, welcome to the second session, which is on climate ecology and resilience in urban environments. And just a couple of thoughts about how urban ecology is emerging as a field. When you want to look at how ecology, especially wildlife ecology, has in some sense flourished in India over the past few decades, urban ecology and urban wildlife is still, in that sense, a marginal part of that. A lot of our ecologists and wildlife biologists, and for the right reasons at that point in time, spent a lot of their time in and projects were initiated in the semi-wild and wild parts of our country. But as urbanization and cities are growing, we are finding that there is an important space for a new field to emerge within ecology. So if you look at the framework that the Baltimore School of Urban Ecology has adopted, so when ecologists come into an urban or urbanizing space, they're looking for ecologies that they are familiar with, habitats and species, and how that's found within the city. And that's called ecology in the city. But then we also found over a period of time that cities are novel ecosystems in their own right, with all sorts of interactions between humans and nature, and between humans and humans, which fashion the nature in the city. So that's and also the interactions between the built and the so-called unbuilt parts of the city. So that was called as ecology of the city. And then finally, you also want to find solutions to emerging challenges, such as the loss of biodiversity, climate change, poverty, many other degradation of the environment within the city. You have to find solutions for that. So then the third phase of this is ecology for the city. And that's where you will find nature-based solutions, blue and green infrastructure, and so on, especially under the current context of climate change, taking a lot of importance in. So we need to, of course, recognize that there's a space for urban ecology even without the climate lens on it. The climate lens just adds a sense of urgency to the way we look at the sustainable transformation of cities and towns. And one last point I want to make is that many terms that we apply in the urban have to be revisited. So as you know, in an urban area, there are lots of things, especially in the global south and in India particularly, we have a lot of interactions with plants and animals that are quite unique and complex. So every day when we go out in the city, probably the first encounter we have with an animal is a dog or a cat, or you will see people plucking flowers for their. So these are interesting, complex phenomena in the city. And the way we term these animals, the animals that share the space with us. For example, a dog can be called a free-ranging dog, it can be called a feral dog, or a stray dog. And the term stray actually implies that it doesn't belong, it's coming from somewhere else. But actually, this is their habitat, the habitat that we have co-produced for some of these animals to share the space with us. So urban ecology, I think, is in some sense still a marginal part of the ecological sciences in India, and urban sciences, which is even more complex and multidimensional, is even much larger arena, which is also fairly poorly developed for us to really make inroads into informing policy and management. So it's great to actually have this panel, and we're going to have a lot of food for thought before our lunch break. And so without any further delay, I'm going to invite Divyanshi from OP Jindal Global University to tell us about how inadequate urban land regulation instruments exacerbate climate injustice. Divyanshi, you have 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, sir. A very good morning to everybody. So my topic, as sir very rightly pointed out, is how land regulation in urban areas land regulation systems are inadequate to actually mitigate climate risks. So how will I approach this topic? The first is through the basic fundamental concept that land is the primary matrix for agglomeration in urban areas. So it forms the most basic natural capital that leads to urban transformation, or as Maria Kaika calls it, the taming of nature. And this leads to an eventual resource degradation that is followed by a natural skewed spread of climate risks, because resource degradation is not even everywhere, and it's much greater in areas that are housed by industrialists or privileged sections. Therefore, the climate risks that are distributed are also very disproportionate in nature. So the aim of my research is to find the threefold answer to, firstly, whether institutional safeguards on land regulations are in fact robust enough to mitigate these climate risks. Secondly, to see whether social sustainability can in fact ever be divorced from climate security in urban areas. And thirdly, to check what kind of strategies can be adopted to bridge these inadequacies that prevail in these institutions. And for this, I have adopted a secondary qualitative research methodology using complex systems thinking, and case studies from Sweden, India, and South America have been taken into account. So firstly, if we look at the findings and discussion which refer to the first part of my research question, whether these institutional safeguards are in fact robust or not, we see that there is a broadly fourfold deficit that we come into contact with when we talk about urban land regulation policies. The first is that the welfare provisions to ensure that excessive private land appropriation does not happen is very much negligible, because in the case of Stockholm City, we find that eventually, despite Sweden having a largely socialist framework of policy making, we do see that there is a gradual trend of neoliberalization of network services in their cities. So what actually resulted through this process was that the district energy company was gradually disinvested, and it was 50% of the shares were sold to a private company. And after this event took place, the private company ensured that they appropriate a larger tract of land that was actually required. They appropriated around 300 meters more than what was actually required, and this led to reduction of land that was available for public utility services. Now, we must keep in mind that a city like Stockholm also has a very high population of low income groups, particularly those who are migrants and refugees from North Africa and the Middle East. So here in this case, lesser land available for public utility services means that human development index indicators such as fuel poverty, inequality, and access to network services will reduce, and there will be a deterioration in these basic requirements that low-income groups require in a city like Stockholm, and that eventually even exacerbates climate risks for the low-income sections, because they will have lesser access to quality network services like infrastructure. They will have greater fuel poverty, something that they're already experiencing. Furthermore, we see that there are weak policy measures. In the case of, say, if we talk about India, we look at East Kolkata wetlands. There is a policy that talks about how there is permission that needs to be sought before introducing or instituting any land use change in the urban frontier region, which is the wetland area. However, the conditions under which the permission can be sought, or rather, what actually qualifies as an appropriate reason to allow land use change, that is very ambiguous. So the government has not specified as to what qualifies as a proper grounds for land use change, which has led to a lot of misuse. This provision has been thoroughly misused, and this has actually led to a lot of wetland shrinkage in many of the ponds in East Kolkata, and it has also led to an overall reduction of the wetland size. And finally, we see that community participation is very negligible when it comes to urban land regulation policy making, because communities such as waste collectors who are often landless, they do not have any access to the resource, and they are not even counted into the policy making ambit or decision making process when environmentalists also take up these issues of wetland destruction in the East Kolkata area. So there are certain marginalized sections which are greatly disenfranchised by this model of what scholars have often called bourgeois environmentalism, and marginalized groups even in Sweden do not have a legal avenue to be mandatorily included in the policy making space. So it's only on the discretion of the councillors whether they want to reach out to them to even place a cap on how much land can be sold to privates, how much it can't be sold to privates. That's completely on the discretion of the councillors, and no community engagement or participation is in any way mandated. Similarly, we see this happening in the case of South American indigenous groups, where we often come across instances of indigenous groups being displaced from their native places. And this is because of the mining codes being relaxed in these areas due to interference, or rather, investment strategies that were suggested by international finance institutions like the World Bank, working in tandem with the national and local regional governments in Latin America, that relax these mining codes, and which leads to greater natural resource degradation, depletion of the Amazonian green belt, and a subsequent displacement of indigenous communities from peri-urban areas. So there is no community consultation that is going on in that aspect. So this is a systems thinking feedback loop that I had created to very effectively demonstrate how these weak institutional safeguards actually exacerbate greater climate risks by projecting that sustainability is being included as part of the policy making priority by using certain buzzwords like sustainable waste management tactics, mechanisms, and natural resource management strategies, without actually engaging the community that is supposed to be the primary stakeholder for waste management practices and sustainable resource usage. So this has also been observed in the case of Hammarby Sjöstad, which was there in the case of Sweden, where the housing assistance that was supposed to be offered to low-income groups was eventually scrapped out. So the low-income groups not only lost their access to land, but they lost they lost access to sustainable waste management mechanisms, as well as natural resource ownership mediums. So finally, if we look at the conclusion and what strategies can be adopted to bridge these structural inadequacies, we can look at the Hubli-Dharwad project of natural resource management as an example of a best practice per se, wherein a lot of participatory decision-making was instituted. Landless Dalit and Adivasi communities were collectivized as sanghas, or through community mobilization initiatives. This led to an increasing of their negotiating power, and it also led to a lot of their opinions and included in the decision-making process for peri-urban land management. And as we all know, restricting peri-urban land management from being dragged into the urban built environment through the process of urban sprawl should be a priority for restricting a neoliberal spreading of urban areas, a disorganized, unplanned spreading of urban areas. So in this case of Hubli Dharwad Natural Resource Project, yes, I'm just finishing up. The community-based forest management communities were formed, which eventually took care of the landless and landowning communities' livelihood options instead of letting that land go into the urban space. So to conclude, I would like to sum up by saying that effective peri-urban community participation can act as a good management strategy to curb urban sprawl, and this will eventually help in reducing resource degradation as well by preventing excessive built environment in urban frontier, natural resource rich regions. That also can eventually curb climate risks. Thank you.
Thanks, Divyanshi, and ending on a encouraging and optimistic note with an example. So we'll now take up the questions which have come online. No, there aren't any questions online, so I'm going to open it up to folks here, including my colleagues here as well. Question for Divyanshi.
This Hubli Dharwad Natural Resource Management Project, you're looking at it as a model for
Yes,
mitigation. But can you say, if you would apply this to the East Kolkata wetland or East Kolkata situation, what would be the similarities, and where could this model diverge?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for that question. So, ma'am, firstly, I would like to draw an analogy into East Kolkata wetlands by firstly talking about land ownership rights. So, in many of the East Kolkata areas, the land is almost entirely, in most of the parcels, is owned by the Wetlands Management Authority. So in this case, if the ownership can be transferred back to the fishing communities who are involved in pisciculture, who are involved in garbage farming, who are also landless communities, if they can be brought together in a collectivized landowning model, sort of like a common property resource model, so that would lead to a more democratic ownership of resources, and it would also prevent any unilateral decision by the state authorities to use that land for any other purpose. In addition to this, what should also be taken into account is the specialized concerns that marginalized communities in the East Kolkata wetlands have, which is significantly different from the Hubli Dharwad region. So in East Kolkata wetlands, a major concern offered by fishermen and the communities that live there is that many a times they are offered prices to sell their land, which is much more lucrative for them than actually keeping the land with the fishing communities. So in this case, there is some market changes, interventions that the government should consider making to ensure that the land that is currently being owned by local communities can be transformed into sustainable livelihood generating avenues instead of allowing them to be sold to real estate developers.
Thanks, Divyanshi. I think now we will go on to the second talk, which is co-producing resilience, lessons from bottom-up practices in informal settlements. Rashee, Mehra, and Sukrit Nagpal, and I think Sukrit will be presenting.
Yeah, thank you, Jagdish. Rashee is going to be joining me online. So just to quickly kind of talk about what we're doing here, we are attempting to talk about co-producing resilience, and we're also attempting to see what lessons we can get from bottom-up practices in informal settlements through two projects, right? Okay, so just a quick overview and a little bit of contextualization with the panel in mind and the overall theme of Urban Arc. What we're doing today is to use two projects together, where both Rashee and I have played very varied roles of being practitioners, of activism, as well as of evaluation. But instead of delving too deeply into the projects, what we're attempting to do is to think through capacitation, which leads to co-production. Now, this is a work in progress idea for us as well. But the reason we're using the two projects together is because through this exploration of varied forms of capacitation and co-production, we see that they can lead to very similar outcomes, which is the inclusion of marginalized residents in planning for service delivery, in city making processes, as well as in resilience building. Yeah. So just some definitions to start us off and to basically foreground some of these points. The two cases are operating at very divergent scales. And what we want to just foreground about informal settlements, which all of you know, is that they largely exist outside the purview of the formal planning apparatus, and they witness fragmented, incremental, and informal development, and they're embedded in everyday risks. So your risks of disease, localized flooding, waterlogging, but also economic, spatial, and social precarity, right? And what we want to also say about climate change is that, and this is again something all of us know, that the impact of climate change on informal settlements is always disproportionate. This could just be because of where they are located, but also the challenge itself, the development challenge, is exacerbated because of climate change, because you'll have, for example, weaker drainage systems or insufficient or inadequate drainage systems. So with that context set, yeah, we are looking at co-production as the joint production of public services, the strategies of the urban poor to secure significant improvements, building of skills and capacities, as well as the complementary role of the state and the community in delivering specific services, which can mean that the community may have the knowledge of where and what infrastructure is lacking, but the actual resources will have to come from the state itself. Yeah, sorry. And just the last bit in the framework, what we are doing for resilience is to actually try to understand it as an outcome. Now, resilience wasn't built into either of these two projects, but it emerged as a vocabulary from the field, because we began to see that even beyond the project cycle, there were various effects that we could see were resilience oriented. So we will talk about those when we get into the cases. Okay, so I'm going to talk about case one and then hand over to Rashee. So the Seva Land Rights Project was a multi-city, which is Patna and Delhi, 4-year-long project in 6 informal settlements with very varying degrees of tenure and prevalent infrastructure. The attempt was to build, specifically for women, awareness and access to basic infrastructure, tenure security, and housing finance. And the project outcome itself was women's economic empowerment and their agency. So what we're going to do here is to look at some examples that talk about both capacitation and co-production in this project, which we are looking at as a service delivery and upgradation project. So the first thing that I want to talk about is just basically how the project collaboratively mapped not just the problem, but its nuance. So what you see here, what you see here is a collaborative mapping exercise that tells you not just the nature of the problem, but what its nuance is. So a water supply problem is different if you think of it as not having pipelines, or the water being dirty, or the pipelines being clogged. So in this case, one would have assumed that the problem was that they get water only 3 days a week, for example. But when we started discussing things, what emerged was that 3 days a week is okay. The larger problem is that those 3 days are not fixed. The timings are not fixed. So that then became one way to understand a very specific problem that people there wanted to solve. Yeah. Okay, cool. The second aspect I want to talk about is capacity building. This is the second aspect, which is fairly intuitive to most of us. So in the interest of time, I will not get into it. But what I will tell you is that we used this form of diagram to essentially demystify planning processes. What it tells you is that, and I mean, it's in Hindi, but what it tells you is that in a city like Delhi, services are divided across the local government, the state government, and the center government. And for communities, very often an intervention point is just the counselor. But what a framework like this helps communities with is just being able to figure out that you can go beyond the counselor to to the MCD office, and just to get a sense of which service has which pathways, essentially. Mobilization, again, is something that you're all very familiar with, but the reason it's here is once you begin to get an understanding of your nuance of the problem as well as your various strategies, then the choices of who you want to engage with in the state and what forms you want to take is very determined by these things. It is negotiation which follows these things where we begin to see more of elements of co-production. So for both service provisioning and tenure security, negotiations allowed for both direct de jure routes and indirect de facto routes. I'm just going to end with a few simple examples of what negotiation looked like. One is just finding joint pathways. So when we were working on electrification in Patna, the department said you can't apply as residents of informal settlements because you have no documentation. To co-produce with the state here meant that you, for example, went to the ward councillor and said, you need to give us a letter on your letterhead to certify that we have been staying here for X number of years, which is a requirement. So those forms of co-production begin to come in. The other forms of co-production that begin to come in are just communities being able to say, these are the 4 areas that need streetlights. These are the 2 spaces where tanks, public water tanks can be placed. So I think these steps essentially start leading to co-production as a final outcome. And yes, in the interest of time, I will hand over to Rashee. But just to also say here before I do that, that resilience is seen in all of this. It's an outcome that begins to build as these capacities are developed. And it is also not like a magic bullet solution. It's just something that begins to emerge. So if you think of flooding in Patna, it's not like the flooding will stop. But the fact that you now have slightly better infrastructure will allow you to cope better with it. And the fact that you now have strategies in place to deal with it will allow you to just react quicker. So yeah, just to conclude here and hand over to Rashee.
Thanks, Sukrit. So the case that I'm speaking about is the Maybe Delhi campaign. And MBD is started in 2018 and is a citizens campaign to make planning in Delhi more inclusive by engaging citizens in the 2041 master plan. And we've been co-producing a lot of research, participatory research, which is also publicly held. And I'm going to sort of speak, really just go towards the conclusion. So if we can skip some slides, we don't have enough time. Just one thing that we wanted to add, can we move the slide, please?
Yeah, 1 second. Rashee, you could take a couple of minutes. I think it's okay.
Yeah, all right. So basically, just wanted to say that the campaign has really looked at a framework of add, challenge, and reframe, where there are, adding big gaps in information on informal sector livelihoods and housing and such indicators, and building connections between these. That there's need to add categories, we say, that are completely missing, such as home-based work in master planning exercises, and filling gaps in information in existing categories as well. Wanted to challenge some instances. The campaign has tried to challenge some instances where official data is contrary to what is seen on ground by activist groups, and such data that is misrepresented, that needs to be corrected, needs to be included in master planning exercises. And we wanted to reframe how official data sources such as master plan looks at categories of home and work, and sort of looking at gender within these, and looking at caste within these, disabilities within these. So to create intersections within within these categories for the master plan, which usually doesn't look at these categories and really exists in silos in many ways. The campaign, in conclusion, like sort of bringing together both the SEVA, which is like a micro level intervention in 6 informal settlements across 2 states, and a meso level campaign like Maybe Delhi. What we're sort of seeing is that co-production emerges through, capacity building that happens with the interventions of activists, civil society organizations, worker unions, etc. Sort of bringing their locally held knowledges and saying that this is valuable and can go into, many urban planning processes. And the other is that the stages of negotiation, and reframing that both Seva and MBD kind of do, doing advocacy, doing dharnas, going to the urban local sort of bodies and saying that these are things that informal settlements need, that there are different kinds of needs that they have, and that these need to be brought into processes and making processes much more suited to the lived realities of people here. And again, like Sukrit said, capacity building or co-production in its various forms and at various levels have had different impacts in both these sort of case studies. And we emphasize, sort of the importance of scale, and there's significant difference in communities being involved in specific local projects or being included in, say, something large like an urban planning, sort of master planning exercise. And yet these projects, sort of have a potential to build and raise developmental baselines, sort of to say that as we build capacities of communities themselves, sort of the residents, the citizens, the activists that work regularly in these sort of geographies also leads to, building, talking about these sort of larger questions of, building resilience. How do you do it? How do you do bottom-up sort of planning, whether it's the everyday challenges that exist in our communities, the communities that Sukrit and I have worked in, and also sort of climate change related, exercises, because flooding in Patna, there's also flooding in Delhi, there's heat impacts in both cities. And these are things that have sort of come up, and this kind of vocabulary, moving away from really the technocratic language of how the state wants to look at it and how non-state actors kind of come in and help produce and co-produce some of this resilience in our cities. So it's these both the campaign and the work of Seva didn't start out looking at building resilience or looking at risks in the way academia looks at climate change risks, etc. But invariably, just by doing some of these things of building these capacities, of mobilizing people, there is possibility and of building resilience in informal communities and in cities, and that's what we sort of have been seeing with the work that we've been doing. So that's it. I think that's.
Thanks, Rashee. We'll first check any online questions. They aren't, so let's open it to the audience.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks for your presentation. So my question is specifically climate change related. And so in cities like Delhi, for example, we know that heat is a huge problem, and it continues to increase in its problematicity. And informal settlements are disproportionately vulnerable to issues like heat and settlement and flooding. So in situations like this, where there is a lack of state, not just infrastructure, but state awareness of the extent of the problem and the manners in which one deals with the problem, how do you go about with the communities who live in these informal settlements?
Are we taking all questions or responding?
Yeah, we can take one more question and then any other question? No. Yeah. Rashee, Sukrit?
You want to say something, Rashee? Can't hear you. This has to happen.
Sorry about that. Thanks for your question. Yes, absolutely. Like you said, the state, in many times just out of, either willfully sort of unseeing how our cities are, or just because of the way, urban planning pedagogies are being sort of developed and are exercised by the state, informal spaces are, have always been left out of, these sort of imaginations, these sort of documentations. And so the only way to really, in our experience of having been part of these campaigns and having been part of projects such as these, is to say that there has to be a level of intervention in which, the language, of, say, climate change or any other such related sort of, many other related, questions that we have for our cities, these inequalities that exist in our cities. One is to, of course, really demystify the technocratic language that the state always takes, and also its processes, which are very exclusionary. Like, say, for example, in the master planning exercise in Delhi, all suggestions and objections could only be submitted online, right? Like, you could not submit in person, but the campaign sort of protested, and we were able to submit about 25,000 objections and suggestions in hand, to the Delhi Development Authority. So it is that kind of capacity building within communities. And we believe that the interventions by activists, by civil society organizations, by unions like SEWA, plays a very key role in bridging that gap. So it will happen slowly. And like we said, like in our cases, very inevitable and a great sort of outcome of this was that the language on resilience, of how resilient cities can be, especially from the margins, like of communities that have been left outside these imaginations, can be bought in. So, for sure, in Delhi, extreme heat, extreme cold, pollution, all of these are very critical sort of things that are happening. And the only way to kind of engage is that kind of co-production with the state. The state also must look at, say, the unions and communities themselves as being, having the wherewithal to kind of, and understanding to say, this is how we think that this can be changed, So that's me. Sukrit, do you want to add anything else?
Just take 30 seconds if that's okay. Yeah, I will promise to take only 30 seconds. I think just like a quick three-pronged response to what you're saying. I think one, what we've seen in a lot of our work in various cities is just that if you can truly like strengthen and provision infrastructure, you end up solving to some extent the problems that climate change leads to, right? The second is, again, like even if you think of something like tenure, right? If you actually are able to strengthen it, and even if it's just de facto like tenure security, even if it's just a guarantee that says we will not evict you, it allows people to invest just a little bit more, right? In specific solutions that they know will, well, like make heat more tolerable, for example, which is what you said. And I think the third thing is just like there exists a lot of local solutions that civil society organizations such as, say, MHT, Mahila Housing Trust, which is the SEWA sister organization, will know that can like mitigate to some extent some of the climate change related risks. But I think all of those fit in this framework only when you know that you will continue to stay here, only when there is some state intervention, right? Otherwise, I think it's also just people afraid of investing time, money, resource into where they are. And yeah, lastly, I think just involving communities in it just gives you a little bit more of that like local knowledge of communities, knowing which areas flood, right? Like where do you need the lines to be, which is something we've seen in a lot of our work. So I think, yeah, just an initial thought on. Thanks.
Thanks, Sukrit. Now from the floodplains and the heat and stress of Delhi, we're going to another interesting environment. In ecology, the Sundarbans. And so the next talk is Gram-Bangla, exploring indigenous communities and marginalities in the Sundarbans. Ishita, Agrawal, Prachi, Rawat, and Constance, Adeline. So 10 minutes.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for having us today. So let's share the screen. Okay, let's start. So hello, everyone. So with Ishita and Prachi, we are happy to present our project called Gram-Bangla, exploring indigenous communities and marginalities in the Sundarbans. So the project today is about mitigating the coastal impact and adapting to the sea level rise by implementing innovative rural nature-based solutions and providing refuge for a balanced human-nature coexistence. So as we know, India is a country with communities living close to nature since thousands of years and have developed some of the most sustainable nature-based solutions that are today largely ignored. So our goal here is to bring light to them and implement it in our design. The site is located in the east of India, in West Bengal. The Sundarbans Biosphere Reserve is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is really known for its biodiversity and mangrove forests. So we analyzed this region and realized that it's one of the most vulnerable area due to sea level rise and cyclones, creating exclusion and vulnerabilities experienced by the community. So jumping to the regional analysis, we see three main zones that have been divided. So we have the core and the buffer zone being the fully forested areas that cannot be touched for any design. And we have the third one on the top, which is the transition zones and is largely inhabited by rural indigenous communities. So this is where the site is. So going into the transport system, once we leave the city of Kolkata, it decreased a lot. And the only way to reach the Sundarbans is by train and then by tuk-tuk or a boat. So the water system here, as we can see, is really dominant and offer a lot of resources to the local. However, the salinity in this region has been increasing a lot as a direct consequence to climate change and has a massive impact on the biodiversity and the population health. So to understand the dynamic of the site, we wanted to understand the evolution of the mangrove through the time, as well as the land. We have seen a lot of erosion in the coastline and sedimentation inland. So on the left, we can see a conclusion map. So as climate change makes existing vulnerabilities even worse, the Sundarbans experience a lot of challenges. So the resultant urban marginality is marked by issues such as low resource management, mass migration, and compromised community livelihoods. So concluding on these challenges and all the scientific research that we have done, we have a potential scenario for 2100 on the left, if nothing changes. So this was the starting point of the regional strategy to fight marginalities. So targeting different goals that we highlighted previously, we made new 3 zones within the transition zones, according to the emergency level of the different zone. New green arteries were developed as well to connect the city of Kolkata to the forest, to the Sundarbans. So those new green corridors also act as transport corridors towards the Sundarbans. And the presence of a disconnected canal, as we can see on the 4 diagrams, made a new water system to bring more fresh water to the villages and agricultural land. So from these little ideas, we came up with 2 strategies from these concepts that we combined it later into the final strategy map. The first strategy focuses on the blue and green connection to the city from the Sundarbans, while taking into consideration the zone emergency level that we can see. The second one focuses on the water management in the most sustainable way, and it also deals with the unique water system that it's called the Pukur, that we will explain a bit later in the presentation. So the final strategy emphasizes on the goal and their intersection and how they can be achieved. According to the emergency level, the zones are to restore the resources, to manage the resources, or to create resilience for the future.
At the rural scale, we zoomed to this area in the Zoom 1 in Sundarbans. So dominantly, this landscape is composed of pukurs, mangroves, agriculture, and estuaries. And we saw that one of the most characteristic landscape element of Indian Sundarbans is this vast network of ponds called pukurs, which serve as a primary freshwater source for the local population here. And in parallel to natural landscape elements, we also wanted to understand the social aspects of the community here. And the communal zones in these villages are quite limited and disconnected and not providing much engagement, not much possibilities for the communities to engage. And few of them that we spotted were like markets or small areas, small shops. And this led us to, and we also went to the site and tried to speak to the local communities here and tried to understand the challenges. And all of that led to a first approach to the strategy, which was to provide access to a large range of fundamental activities and resources for the communities here within a 2 to 4 kilometer radius. And this would be like a prototype for this area, and these small 2 kilometer, 4 kilometer radius can be connected through a spine. And as Constance already talked about, being in zone 1, which is the level of emergency, we also wanted this area needs to restore the resources, and the fundamental requirement was to restore the mangrove belt in these islands using different nature-based solutions. So this is a kind of map which shows the challenges in a 2-kilometer radius that we studied more in detail, and it shows that that the coast is highly vulnerable to sea. With the sea level rise, there's intrusion of salt water when there are cyclones, and amongst all the other things that are happening. And monoculture is really dominant in the landscape. And this is, we tried to draw a vision for this area based on the strategies that we talked about. So this is an example of a 2-kilometer module with a new green and blue connections, and in this case, taking into consideration the existing agriculture in the center, a loop is proposed which connects the existing active center on the left and a new proposed one on the right, with a new shelter and empowerment center has been introduced in the landscape also for the community. This map shows the nature-based solutions in the landscape, which works together with each other and support the strategy and help address the challenges of this area. Example, mangrove restoration with sustainable dams, shifting to salt-tolerant agriculture. And here is a map which shows the projection of devastation, which we could see in case of a cyclone in the current scenario, where we can see the embankment breaches, heavy destruction and flooding all across the island with a large intrusion of salt water in agriculture. And this is a map which shows the resilience of the landscape after the design solutions are implemented. In an ideal scenario, the infrastructure damage would be reduced immensely and the livelihood of the people would be safe with the salt-tolerant agriculture, and the shelter will give them refuge in case of extreme weather events.
Okay, I would talk very quickly about the Refuge and Empowerment Center. I saw that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to start explaining the design. And this was imagined as an inclusive and safe space for the communities. So the Empowerment Center has been designed as something embedded into the landscape and designed along with the landscape elements, the pukurs, and the things that the communities have lived with for like so many years. So the structures on the element of the plinth were born with the grid system, along with the water management, a very intricately designed water management system, which helps reducing the flooding, along with retention basins and all that, so that we create a hierarchy of the nestled water systems. Can you move ahead, please? So here is the master plan, where you can see that the design is really embedded in the landscape and designed with the landscape. And we can see that in the surroundings, there are a lot of trees, a lot of pukurs, which have also been incorporated in the design along with the buildings. I would move very quickly to the spatial functions, where we can see that all pukurs have been designed with a specific function towards the community, because we are focusing a lot on building resilience in the community. So these are the system of pukurs, buildings, and public spaces designed together. And I would like to point out that all the materials used to build this particular center are locally sourced, are from nearby communities, and so they are very economical, and they are used daily by the people here. So it's very much embedded in the community as well. Okay, moving towards the sections. The sections more focus on the functions of the buildings and the functionalities. So we can just move with the sections and the all the visuals. And I would just conclude here because I think the time is up. So concluding, we would like to focus a lot on the community-centric perspective. So only by embracing the community-centric perspective within the framework and knowledge exchange can we build resilience within the communities. And that's what our base idea was with this presentation. And that's where we are wrapping up with these views, where we see the rural and aesthetic feeling of the landscape with the cultural ties. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishita, Prachi, and Constance. I will now check any online questions. No. So, audience.
I have a question actually. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed the rich visuals in the presentation. I'm sort of connecting it to the previous presentations, the one on land and regulation, and then on co-production of communities in the state. So how would you? I'm interested to know, like, how would you see these design solutions, nature-based design solutions, sit with some of the existing regulatory framework and governance and capacities that exist at the moment? Thank you. And if anyone has any other questions, please do raise your hand.
I just want to add one thing to that. Is there anybody else will give preference to? You want? Okay.
Yeah. So throughout the presentation, we from a very huge scale, we came to a particular building scale, and it was I don't know, how much of time have you been onto that site where and what has been the interaction through the people? And because those maps was there that these particular buildings or built forms are there which are which will get affected, and if some things if we propose this type of solution, the things will. So are they done through that satellite maps, or what sort of things, or is it how much of interactive this collection of rather design or any sort of information which has been collected in there? So I just wanted to know about it.
So I just wanted to add to that is the scalability and replicability of this pilot experiment, given that things might be different in other parts, other settlements, and also challenges might also be different. So.
Okay. Any of you want to start, or should I go ahead? Okay, I think I'll go ahead. Thank you so much for your questions. All the three questions are really kind of different but similar to each other. So I will start by saying, firstly, we worked on this project for a really long time, more than 1 year we spent on working on this project. So we tried to understand all scales, all kind of replicability, the modular, how will it work together. And also we went to the site, we stayed there. We interacted with the locals. We had some questionnaires and we were trying to interview them, try to understand what the community perspective is before actually putting anything in the landscape. So that's how we went from a larger scale to a smaller scale, by trying to understand what's happening through Google Maps, through all the other geoportal stuff, and then by actually going to the community, because also Sundarbans is a very, very, very large area. So we really just can't do one small thing in 1 square kilometer and it's done throughout. So that's why the scales were brought in, and also we tried to design in a way that it can already be in different kind of zones, like kilometer zones, which we weren't able to explain really in detail here. Also answering the question about the governance, there was a study, we did a study of all the land regulations, everything happening there, what are the NGOs doing, what is the government doing from their side. Because of the disaster management team and all that, we even met some of the officials in these villages to try to understand what happens in these cases. And what we saw there was not really a great response to disaster management by these, only the NGOs were actually working on building some kind of resilience in these communities. But from the government side, the response was not really great. In terms of, if any of you want to talk more about this, please.
Brief.
Sorry. I'm following what Ishita was saying. This thesis has been, we've been working on this thesis for years, so we couldn't show as much as we wanted in the 10-minute time. But in parallel to this project, we designed a nature-based solution catalog with the aim to be able to replicate those different solutions within the transition zone. So that was the third zone that I showed on the map. because the landscape, the characteristic of the areas are quite similar to each other. So they could be replicated. Those solutions could be used in different villages, even though, of course, every project would be different. But this catalog is really useful to create any project without any, you don't need a lot of knowledge because they're quite easy solutions to implement. So that's something that we thought would be useful in order to replicate the different projects along the transition zone.
Thank you. Now, urban ecology is incomplete without the animals that we share space with. And so the next talk is by Sneha Gutkutia from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Pigs in Informalized and Invisibilised Caste Ecologies in Delhi.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll straight away get to the talk. So I have to point there. This. Okay. So the talk I'm presenting today is based on ethnographic research that I conducted in Delhi in 2019 as part of my ongoing PhD. So the utmost aim of my research is to rethink urban marginality and precarity by examining human porcine relationships. And within this larger aim, I first examine, next slide. Can you change the slides? Yeah. I first examine human-pig relations in urban informal settlements in Delhi and Guwahati. Today I'm presenting my Delhi work. Specifically to understand modes of cohabitation and the roles that pigs play in the social lives and livelihoods of the poor. Next slide. Second, I analyze how people, mainly the pig rearers, the pig butchers, pork sellers, as well as pigs, are marginalized in the city. Within this marginalization, what I'm trying to understand is how this marginalization operates. Basically, what are the social, economic, and spatial dynamics are at play? How is this marginalization affected by the notion of informality and the idea of a healthy, sustainable city? And how does the perception of other actors and the state also marginalizes these actors? So, next slide. It's not working. Okay. So in Delhi, I found that in its informal settlements, that is, the members of the Valmiki community rear pigs. So many of these people from these communities are employed in low-level private or government jobs under precarious contracts, and they engage in the practice of pig rearing for secondary income. They rear pigs in a semi-domestic manner where they feed pigs once or twice a day. Can you just, next slide. Twice a day, and the rest of the day the pigs are left to forage freely in open drains, on wastelands, next slide, on garbage mounds or at other dumping sites. So the Valmikis reside in close vicinity of these sites in informal settlements. Now the pigs are indigenous and they're understood as such by the black color, small size, and the bristles all along this spine. Next slide. Pig rearing is also expressed by rearers as a form of time pass. Before that. As a form of time pass. And in the context of this research, yeah, can you just go 2 slides before? In the context of this research, two slides before. Okay, it's okay. So in the context of this research, time pass is also understood as an indication of socio-temporal precarity that Valmikis engage in their free time along with pigs to overcome. So on a typical day, the rearers will feed the pigs before they leave for duty. On the way back from work, they collect waste food from restaurants, canteens, and messes as fodder to feed the pigs. Discarded tubs, drums, and drums are repurposed to serve as troughs. The architecture of the slum is reworked to accommodate pigs. Next slide. Potholes become mangers. Metal scraps are salvaged to form pens. Next slide. Protecting lactating females and the young ones from predators such as jackals at night. Next slide. Pigs, on the other hand, repurpose spaces and materials rendered useless as places to forage and live. Throughout the day, the pigs eat from garbage or sewage, deriving nutrition from it. Next slide. A highly fragmented Indian social structure based on caste, where historically marginalized sweeper communities such as the Balmikis and the pigs are condemned as untouchables, are relegated to the urban margins, and this in a way enables these porcine ecologies and pork economies that provide for and replicate life in these pockets of Delhi. Next slide. Pigs become a means of production for the Balmiki community and enable us to re-examine everyday life in informal settlements, telling a different story of urban infrastructures and precarity as Delhi takes a step further in its vision to become a global world-class city. Next slide. First, it reveals that the making of urban form is not a human endeavor alone. Pigs not only help in disposing of solid waste, but also bring waste back into circuits of value through their bodily work. Consequently, the ruins of infrastructure become a porcine world. This tells a whole other story of the built environment, one that is often glossed over in humanist accounts of informal settlements and their infrastructures. Next slide. Further, closer ethnographic inspection reveals that pigs are caught up in a range of socio-cultural and economic practices across the city. The Balmikis rear pigs because the goddess they revere, goddess Masani, is a fierce goddess who demands piglets for sacrifice. The Balmikis believe that evil befalls on them if they do not revere the goddess in the way she wishes and do not seek her blessings for every important event in their life. In such realities, raising pigs is like having a prepaid account, which can then be easily sold for cash, sacrificed for religious purposes, slaughtered for cultural reasons, such as to feed guests during marriage feasts, as explained by a participant from the field. In social sciences, infrastructural ontology has widened today to understand that infrastructure not only affects human and non-human mobilities, but it is the very medium for both to thrive. Infrastructure is more than the material conditions of existence. It is not only the background substrate that sustains human life, but it is also habitus, a melding of habit and habitat. Therefore, as more than a resource, as a social and political actor, waste influences human porcine interactions, dispositions, furnishes a habitat, and becomes infrastructural for pig rearing. On the other hand, entanglements and conjunctions with porcine life suggests alternative ways in which social reproduction of urban lives take place in these settlements. Pigs enable rearers, butchers, pork sellers with precarious urban lives and limited means to find expanded opportunities for economic fulfillment. In the same vein as people's activities, their various interactions in space and time have been conceptualized as infrastructure. Next slide. However, these pig rearing related infrastructures are widely repressed by the state and majoritarian logic. Narratives of Delhi's elite residing outside these settlements and the state's impetus to ban urban farming render pigs unwelcome. Pigs are associated with squalor that untunes the aesthetic projection of Delhi as a global city. Pig rearing practices are regarded as a potential health hazard to the city and acts like butchering unsettled middle-class sensibilities. Therefore, the state is not only reluctant to provide facilities to rear and slaughter pigs, but it also censors the supply of pork. Indeed, there is no recognition for such informal and animal infrastructures in state-centric view of infrastructure. Next slide. Besides the Balmiki, other scheduled caste groups, Khatiks and Sonkars, are also involved in this economy, and they butcher pigs and also sell this meat in their pork shops. Now, they have not been able to run their business as before because they face the threat of shutdown every now and then due to state and citizen concerns around public health. They say that the issue is because of perceived pollution due to disposal of blood and slaughter waste within city limits. Next slide. Some also attribute this precarity to the fact that urbanization is taking place all across Delhi and its adjoining states from where the pigs come as supply. And everywhere where pig rearing is prohibited due to urbanization, and this has overall reduced the supply of pigs, affecting their business. They also point to the taboo associated with the consumption of pork, notions of purity associated with the pig, and the harassment they face as a result. Many Khatiks have said that they have shifted to selling mutton or goat meat instead. Next slide. In fact, discourses around pigs, pork, and management of pig-related practices in the city run deep into a colonial past, where these practices of the state were actively converted to policies, acts, and other legislation based on colonial notions of sanitation, violence towards animals, and hygienic meat to regulate them. In the present, this colonial legacy continues as contemporary laws and policies or are a derivative of it. Such practices of the state actively regulate the practices of communities involving pigs and the lives of pigs themselves in the city, thereby eliminating them from the urban public sphere, both in the present and historically, which not only results in marginalization, but also invisibilization politically and physically. Next slide. Moreover, in India's crowded metropolises, discourses around urban environmentalism, everyday contestation for space, and an ever-increasing demand for real estate further marginalizes and invisibilizes these practices of people and the presence of pigs themselves. It is well documented that such environmental politics and the pursuit for green and clean living spaces within the city threaten the survival of the working class by excluding their basic concerns for food, shelter, water, sanitation, and in this case also their concerns for their social and cultural and temporal fulfillment. And this has aptly been termed as bourgeois environmentalism. Furthermore, animals that are valued as pets become a nuisance for public health and safety if they are found straying or being domesticated as sources of food, income, and other utilitarian purpose in the fabric of the urban social life, and they must be ousted outside of the city. The practices of pig rearers and butchers in the urban public space therefore blurs the divide between what is rural and urban, asking poignant questions about what is urban formation in these such contexts. On the other hand, the infrastructural practices of the state and urban citizenry reinforce these binaries by an act of bordering, where they expunge these activities from the urban space or delimit them to ghettos, and ordering by controlling the public space in order to make them void of the presence of animals, which are considered unfit for existence in the urban. So both pigs and people are subjected to the same onslaught of majoritarian logic. Yet, we see that pigs become infrastructure for the poor to deal with urban precarity, while they themselves repurpose waste as infrastructure, and the pigs continue to lead precarious lives amidst the mangle of infrastructure.
Thanks,
thank you.
Sneha. So, any online questions? No, so we don't. So, audience, yeah.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. So my question is, where are these pigs going? Who are consuming the meat of these pigs? And is Delhi or any other city nearby where this location is, are there consumptive practices anyway affecting the marginalities of the people there? So for instance, the question of Chicago in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you could see that the erasure of butcher shops from the city, deeming it unclean and so on and so forth. So any such things happening in this area? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
We can take, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. So you mentioned Balmiki community. I just wanted to know the spatial concentrate, like where exactly the study was conducted in Port Delhi and Bangalore, in order to get a spatial aspect that where these locations were with respect to elite communities.
Okay, there's one more question there.
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me? Thanks for your excellent presentation. My question is a little long-winded, so please excuse me.
Keep it short.
But I'll try as much as I can to keep it short. But like your to
We can't hear.
Yeah. I'd like to contrast your research on pig-human relationships to two other examples on different ends of the spectrum. So, for example, we see that cow rearing or goat rearing isn't really associated with as much stigma as pig rearing, for example, even though it's still often practiced by marginalized communities. And on the other hand, we also find that the same ecologies of the same sort of invisible ecologies utilizing waste, etc., are being used in situations where humans are not active participants at all. For example, by rats or street dogs and things like that, right? So I'd like to ask you to speak to that, how you see your research taking place on that sort of scale, and also how you think design can be implemented to sort of accommodate these practices and allow communities to practice them.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, do you see a future for pigs and pig rearing based livelihoods, given the types of changes? Because in Delhi earlier, even the cattle dairies were shifted out in the mid-70s. And so now it might be the turn of pigs to make space for other types of food.
Okay. Okay. So in the context of my research, specifically in Delhi, I found that there is sort of ecology and economy within the informal settlements itself, where pigs who are reared in the informal settlements get butchered, and within the informal settlements, there are designated areas where this butchering happens, and they are sold within pork shops within this informal settlements itself. Some of the pigs also go to there are 3 slaughterhouses for pigs in Delhi. Some of them also go to those slaughterhouses, but those slaughterhouses, but there are very few. Most of them get consumed within this economy that is invisible, that is not something that we know of within the informal settlements. So that answers my one question, that in Delhi, I went to informal settlements, and within the settlements itself were fragmented, where the Balmiki colony was at some end, and the Balmiki and the Muslim colonies were at the the worst part of the trailing part of the settlements, which would be closest to the nalas or the open drains or the garbage dumps. So yes, consumption of meat does increase their marginality, because it sort of pig rearing and pig consumption reinforces their caste status as Balmikis, and that sort of sets in place another vicious cycle where what I'm talking about is social reproduction, where they continue to be stigmatized as their low caste status, and which also in turn has a spillover effect on their socio-economic status and disadvantage that they still continue to face in the contemporary. They are socio-spatially segregated. Education and other aspects that they would tell me, they lag behind. They would say that आप आज ये पढ़ाई कर रहे हो, हमारी तीसरी या चौथी जनरेशन शायद आपके लेवल तक पहुंच पाएगी. So this is very important anecdote that talks about the burden of this caste-based marginalization and the stigma that they have and they carry, and sort of pig rearing reinforces this caste status. Now, I would like to answer the last question first. The future. So Delhi definitely has very strict policies, and one of the reasons why these practices exist is because they exist where no one can see them, in garbage dumps in wooded areas around nalas where I and you wouldn't go, but where communities exist. And very strikingly enough, there would be a Balmiki community and there would be a Muslim community there, and the Muslims loathe pig and the Balmikis live with pigs, but they would tolerate each other. And the only rule was that the pigs should not come onto the narrow streets of the settlement. And the pigs do not. They are very timid animals. So that's the only reason why it continues. And even the slaughterhouses are authorized, but they are not government owned, government sanctioned. But government is not providing a slaughterhouse. So even slaughtering is continuing within very dense and very economically important real estate areas of Delhi, where a lot of lobbying is going around to oust them out of those areas. But there is also a lot of lobbying from the Khatik communities, extremely mobilized, and they have approached Supreme Court to stay put in their areas. But we don't know. I mean, I think just like in the West, we will see a complete wipeout of these smaller actors. And just like what happened with the Idgah and the goat, sheep, chicken, buffalo slaughterhouse, I think private players will come in at one point of time. Just that people don't talk about the pig and realize it as much as we understand chicken, goat, sheep, and cows. And I think that also sort of answers your question on vis-a-vis cow rearing, vis-a-vis goat rearing, vis-a-vis rearing in similar invisible ecologies of waste. Yes, it is contrasting because of the stigma associated with the animal, but you always see them rearing together at the same spot. Cows, goats, dogs, kites. So there is stigma, but there is also, I don't know, I think there is sort of a tolerance because all of these people, these rearers, they also wouldn't, they are very segregated within themselves as well. But sort of these ecologies and things are at play. Like I said, Balmikis will rear pigs because they say, "Hum apne free time ka kya kare? What do we do with our free time? So let me engage in pig for time pass." So such smaller things keep these practices in place together when they contrast.
Thanks, Neha. So Indian cities have some of the highest densities of free-ranging dogs, and human-dog interactions are at the center of the ecology of a city. And so, so it's nice to have a talk on navigating the urban stray dogs conundrum lying beyond the margins of planning and governance by Mallika Sarbai from IHS and Chaitanya Lodha also.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chaitanya and my colleague Mallika. So we are currently working on this paper titled Navigating the Urban Stray Dogs Conundrum, Lying Beyond the Margins of Planning and Governance. So let me first tell you where we are stemming from. So this slide basically tells our position as researchers. Colonial, yeah?
We can see your pointers. I mean, like the slides.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah.
That's one. So how do I head this?
Yeah, it's perfect now.
It's better now?
Yes.
Sure. So basically, colonialism and informality have together co-produced the state of exception that is rooted in socio-political construction of human-animal binary. What we are saying is that the relation of power and powerlessness has always been anthropocentric. Hence, trying to understand the marginalization through this lens of stray dogs embodies a narrative that highlights the historical patterns of ostracization. At a larger level, what this study is trying to do is basically attempting on how can we navigate sustainable, not just existence, but co-living. And here co-living means interaction, because interactions is what helps us thrive and live. So how can we co-live with these non-human actors? So I'll just go through what we are going to show in this presentation, basically understand what are the stray dogs and why do we even need to study them. We'll tell you about our methodology and then move to casteism and animal cruelty and how planning and governance sees stray dogs. And finally, how NGOs are currently working in this entire stray dog ecosystem. So what are stray dogs? There's a definition given by World Society for Protection of Animals. Any dog in public area that is not under direct human control. So this encompasses unowned dogs as well as community-owned dogs, but it will exclude the dogs which are on leashes or under direct human control. And these dogs, which are community dogs, unowned dogs, could previously be owned dogs, or they can be just feral dogs or wild dogs that have never been owned. So this is sort of the definition when we are looking at the stray dogs. And why do we even care? Or why do you care about it? So firstly, India is the epicenter for rabies globally. with over 36% of global cases and 65% of cases in South Asia are India alone. Further, there is an increasing population with recent estimates of 6.2 crore stray dogs in India itself. And with these growing numbers, the interactions with them have as well been increasing. And with more often than not, they are more likely negative interactions or conflicts, dog bites, people harming dogs. And hence, both animals and humans become victims of these interactions, of these negative interactions. And even if someone doesn't really particularly care about animals, studies have shown that there is a very strong correlation between animal abuse and child abuse. So 88% of the households which have recorded child abuse have also been engaged in animal abuse. So this just puts into perspective that this is a very particular important issue that we need to look at, of how do we live with these people, with these biodiversity within the urban areas. So so we stem from our research question of how do we navigate the sustainable co-living with the non-human actors, and we have taken this lens of stray dogs in urban areas. And what we did through our literature review, we understood the modes of interactions and perceptions between human and stray dogs. And we sort of divided these into two, these interactions as form of individuals and society, or how the system of governance looks at the biodiversity and the stray dogs. We identified these points of contentions in these interactions, and further, we hope to actually talk with urban local bodies and NGOs. So it's a work in progress to understand how we can move forward of living with these biodiverse spaces. So I'll shift to Malika.
Hi. So when we talk about stray dogs' presence is very much linked to casteism in class. Why? Because the majority of the dogs that you see on streets are the Indian pariah. And very interestingly is what the colonial did was they gave them the name, and that was pariah, which comes from the caste pariah. And in a way, they used our inherent hate towards casteism, and then they just decoded Indian dogs to be something that should not be concerned of. And then you would also see the way how they viewed Indian dogs, in the way they mistreated them, they were hunted, they were brutalized, and then they were also used for a lot of scientific testing at that time. This is something which even in 2023, the central government proposed. There was a proposal of bill where they wanted the street dogs to be used for medical testing, which later got rejected, but then talks about that even in today's scenario, the imagination of street dogs is something that that shouldn't be here, something more related to being low graded. And then with current times, you see that the ownership of breed dogs are seen in synonym of being, somebody of higher standard living. And that is why your Indian dogs are not on, being taken up as pets. And this sort of gives you the point that even if you push all these street dogs in animal shelter homes, there's going to be nobody taking them. So basically, in a way, you're putting them in long sentence of jail period. And then when there'll be a lot of dogs, you will euthanize them, which is happening in countries like America, UK, Saudi Arabia. Coming to the next one is, so when we talk about stray dogs, it is also very important to understand what is the reality of them, because often we associate them with rabies and them biting. But what is the reason to why they are attacking humans is, one, they're territorial and protective, which comes from the natural instinct, that they would try to assert some kind of claim to the space they exist, to the humans they interact, and the younger ones. And then additional to that is a phenomena that happens on the background, which is illegal breeding, where your breeders who have no license start exploiting the exotic breeds. And once they find that these breeds are no longer productive to making money, they leave them on road. So with addition of new dogs, these dogs will start becoming more aggressive. And the reciprocal behavior here talks about that what we see as aggression is more like a reactivity to how they react to how the environment in which they contain. So if you're going to be very positive with them, they are actually going to socialize with you in a very friendly way. But if you keep on treating them in a negative way, they are going to react in aggression. And which is being seen when they are attacking our kids, or attacking our elderly people. So it's like a very systemic way of violence that they endure, and then they react to it. It's like the third law of Newton. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So they are negatively going to react to us. coming to the other slide.
Quickly, yeah.
Yeah. So comes to cruelty is we have a Prevention of Cruelty Act, which says that, if you are aggressive towards him or you're being cruel, you would be jailed, but it's very easily bailed. And there are no records against cruelty against animals, especially dogs. So most of what you would gather is through social media. And then your animal birth control programs are also very sporadic. They lack capacity, even from the governance aspect and from what the NGOs are trying to push. Urban local bodies always resort to either mass killing or, relocating them. This is something very common in almost even today. This is very historic, but even happens today. And then there is also the fiction that happens from residential welfare associations that they don't want stray dogs. They are associated with something that shouldn't be there. The other slide. Yeah. Informality in planning comes from the aspect of anthropocentrism and informality in it. So what planning does is we take it from the colonial side of planning. So there is no space for urban ecology. It's always seen in spaces of green spaces or water bodies. So then there is no contestation of them. And also you would see phenomena like, smart city missions where they want, or the city beautification, where they want cities to look some kind of global standard. And then they will resort to either killing them or relocating them. This was happening in case of Visakhapatnam and Kochi in the smart city mission, or the host city of G20, which was very common, like very recent. In Delhi, they removed the dogs. And comes to...
We have to wrap up now.
Okay. Yeah, so basically this slide is just talking about that planning in general takes in account of them. And it's also just that planning uses criminalization of, removing them. The other slide talks about how in governance also, Chaitanya, do you want to continue?
Yeah, so I'll just brief this shortly. Basically, what we were trying to understand, what are the activities that government is doing, both from legislature, from executive, and from the judiciary. Basically, what you see on the y-axis is if the actions are good for the stray animals, and the bottom is if they are bad for the stray animals. On left and right, it's basically relates to cattle. And basically, you can see the spread across verticality, from across legislature, across judiciary, and across executive, that their stance has constantly been changing. And so this is sort of the governance conundrum. What is the positionality of the government on the issue of stray dogs? Sometimes the High Court is saying that animals are legal person, but the same High Court later on in 2023 says removes these dogs near the judges' houses. So these sort of conundrums.
Chaitanya, we have to wrap up quickly, please.
Yeah, this is the last
few
slide.
seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, from the governance aspect comes there's gap, and that is where NGOs and welfare individuals come. So they are sort of protecting them, but then they're also being marginalized further away. It could be a financial burden or them being kicked out of their homes because RWAs don't want them. And you might have a legal binding document saying that you cannot do this, but then it's still being continued. And even from legal constraint, you don't have a proper provision that sort of protects the NGOs and the stray dogs from any kind of criminalization. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one question, only one question.
Thank you again. That was an excellent presentation. So my question is generally a bit broader. So what could be a potential design intervention or an urban theory per se that could bridge the gap in analyzing quote unquote dangerous animals like stray dogs, etc., and the urban citizen? So what could be a potential intervention there?
It's very interesting you use the word dangerous because it's sort of very...
I said quote unquote.
But that's the phenomena that's also being, coming in your policies of the way you see them. There was a very interesting study by ICER Kolkata, and they proved that the way you react with them is the way they're going to react with you. So the best way is to, we have capacity issue, we have a funding issue. And there is a big gap in the governance. But there is also this attempt made by NGOs to bring into them, build resilience in the governance aspect also. You need to stop looking at your cities as just spaces for humans, because there's going to be never-ending battle. The way you start relocating dogs, they're going to come back. You kill them, you'll never hit the 100% of mass killing them. But what we can do is follow the footsteps of Bhutan. They took 14 years, and they've achieved 100% sterilization of the dogs. So we have a policy. We are saying that, you can vaccinate them, you can sterilize them. That will reduce the population, that will reduce your chances of rabies. but we are not able to achieve that. So the struggle comes with we not taking in the informal aspect, which is a process of how NGOs are pushing it for it. So bring them in the conversation.
Exactly, and that is a further process. Basically, is in our next part of the study. Basically, we are going to start talking with the NGOs, and hopefully, if we are able to, the government officials as well, of how we can actually incorporate NGOs as well into formal systems and processes of managing the street dogs. Because these are people who have consistently been very much clear about their positionality with respect to stray dogs.
Okay, thanks, Mallika and Chaitanya. So we have one more talk, another interesting talk. It's on extensions in disaster-induced resettlement sites, a tool for placemaking in the urban peripheries, by Suchismita Goswami, University of Copenhagen.
Hi, so I'm Suchismita from the University of Copenhagen, and the person in between you and your lunch. So I was trying to look into, in the resettlement sites, how they have this specific tool making. It is a handmade, locally designed tool that was that these people came up in the resettlement sites to have. Thank you. To help them navigate climate change, like flood, heat, and like their livelihoods. So just before we go there, I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the housing policy that has been in Chennai. So like from the 1930s, as there are people who were So there, so from the 1930s, there have been occupation by people from different parts of Tamil Nadu to the riverine areas of Chennai. And the land policy of the 70s were actually under the DMK was quite pro people. Like they were looking at having housing for the people, and they were looking at housing for the people. They were into right-based housing. But post-liberalization, when the World Bank came into the picture, it was more of this large-scale, housing, which is like in the outskirts of the city, on the because it is more cost-effective and they are providing housing for more people, right? So that is how the housing policy has been, and these en masse housing have been designed in the city of Chennai, like many other cities in the country, for building infrastructure development projects. But then there was also these big events tsunami and floods that happened in Chennai, for which again people were put into these resettlement sites. And the main reason why they were being shifted from the city was that you are not safe in these spaces. It is prone to disaster, and we have to take you to a place where it is you will be more safe and there will not be a disaster. So they were taken about 20 to 25 kilometers away from the city. So now let me take you to their houses. So so this is one of the houses, in the resettlement site. It is of around 250 square square feet of housing that was available to them. And there were a lot of struggles that they were going through in these. It was these resettlement sites are actually in the ecosystem where it is actually floodplains, where there is recurrent flood, and it is now much more difficult for them to navigate floods than they were in the informal settlement. For years, they the kind of knowledge they had of navigating the floods. Right now, they do not know how to navigate the floods in the resettlement site, and the way they are being completely disconnected with their community and with the government, with the local networks. So I'll just quote one of the women saying we get these floods every year. If there is going to be a flood, the government would make prior announcement, and we would take all the important documents and take shelter in schools or in community halls. As we lived in central Madras, the water used to drain in 1 or 2 days. The government used to make that effort. Then we used to wash our houses and go back to our own routine life. But here it takes 7 to 8 days to come back to routine life, as we are allotted to the first block. So even if the water starts draining, all the water will get accumulated in our blocks for a much longer period, halting our lives, mobility, and livelihood. So this speaks a lot about how these, apart from these flooding, of course, like due to the small size of the house, there is suffocation, and then there is diseases, and there is actually no livelihoods to speak of. So now taking you to the tool that they have been building, that is, So this is the extensions that I have been talking to you about. So extension is not new in the city. There have been different kinds of extensions that we see, but not much have been written about extensions in government planned resettlement sites. So this is one of them. And I'll just like to illustrate how this extension, specifically this extension came into place. So you can see so their house is limited, their land rights is limited to the house that is given to them. But if you can see then there is this patchwork of elevating their flooring. So that was done by the people with, where the government officials, the Slum Development Authority, actually encouraged them to do that, to mitigate the disasters, because they were not finding any other way to resolve it. So they actually, encourage the people that, you can elevate the land on your own, and that will help you to prevent floods. So once they did that, they also had some shed for heat mitigation, which was followed by a little bit of green gardening. And then in the side, you will see there is also this storage. So that is how, in the longitudinal way, over the period of 5-6 years, this whole extension was built by this particular family. There is also a family who have built almost similar kind of extension to make a shop out of it. So, this particular family was shifted to this to another site due to the tsunami. And in the site where she was during the tsunami, she used to have a tiffin shop. And after coming to the resettlement site, she did not have any livelihood because, of course, if you are 20-25 kilometers away from the actual site, you don't have a livelihood source. So she actually started with some very informal means, and then slowly, gradually over time, she did end up building these kind of extension. And I also wanted to tell you that, over the years, because they were in the informal settlement, they have been building and planning and envisioning their houses on their own in the informal sites. And even after the tsunami or the flood, when they were in the temporal setting, in between before coming to the resettlement site, they were asked by the government to be in one of the construction site where they again built their own, shelter on their own with leaves and with other very temporal materials. And then these kind of placemaking comes very historically to them. So I'll just like to conclude that extension making is a strategic response for navigating emerging vulnerabilities and precarities in resettlement sites, serving as a means to contend with new risks. In the existing literature on disaster studies, housing modification and extensions are considered as an indicator of successful resettlement, as it assures some kind of acceptance and permanence towards the site. A similar complex process of building extension was observed in the resettlement site of Philippines after a tropical storm and cyclone. We argue that extension making is not an acceptance of resettlement, but a coping mechanism. So it is very interesting to note that resettlement in the disaster studies is actually an adaptation, and it has actually failed. That's why they have to come up with coping mechanism to navigate that. So it is a socio-political response to the precarious living condition, lack of satisfaction from the overall living condition, community cohesion, safety, and continued threat of disasters. We also would like to talk about, to look at these resettlement and adaptation, especially of big disasters, in a more life cycle way, like where and when we are also looking at the bigger theme of marginality today, like where they were staying and how they were staying and how they were coping and how much they have moved across the generation. Here I'm talking in a time scale to about 20 to 30 years. And how are they, and did their coping and adaptation have actually moved a lot, that, and how as a city then we are looking at resilience. And lastly, the way of this placemaking and extension making, and which is in the urban literature is understood as auto-construction, almost act as a rhizome for them, like a delusion rhizome, which however much ever you cut, it again finds a way to erupt. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Suchismita. Any online questions? No. So, audience, we'll have 2 questions.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I had one quick question on this idea of extensions. What you're talking about is something I wonder how will it fit under the whole unified development control regulations, which a lot of states are doing, like Maharashtra being a case in point, where there is an approach where it's about very much defining things, like having set offsets, etc. Right? So of course, this auto construction has always been there, prevalent in the city. But then how will it look like when it comes to institutionalizing or formalizing this coping mechanism or formalizing these extensions, where there is what happened, for example, in Indore, in one of the settlements which Balkrishna Doshi had designed, where there was a plot which was given with a set of offsets, and then you could do it as per your family needs, your financial upgradation, etc. But not all the policies are actually suiting this inclusive interface which allows for the extension. So how will it look like when it comes to, let's say, formalizing something like this in a green field, for example?
One more question, and
yeah,
articulated briefly.
Yeah, I have a very small question. It's just out of curiosity. I can't see you, but I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So I just was wondering about how you were talking about the movement from previous informal settlements to these new spaces. And as we know, there's just a lot of community and kinship that's built, which is also very gender-based. So when they move to such faraway areas into these new spaces, the question around extensions and building new communities, does that come into place? Like how people build these new communities? Are these extensions collaborative efforts in these new communities and these new spaces that they are now a part of? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I completely understand about this unified, infrastructure and, how will it work out. To tell it, it is actually a informal construction, these extension. It was not part of the plan, and it is, I'll not say illegal, but it's an illicit, planning or infrastructure, so as to say. And people, here, because the government is not being able to give a solution, and due to the allyship that these people have with the NGOs and the other people who have raised the voices for them, they were able to come up with these kind of infrastructure. Otherwise, it is definitely not part of the plan, and the government don't want to encourage it, and they want to keep it in a. And I was not able to share. So there were people who said of course we know it is illegal, and we will take it out if the government tells us to do that. And the government is yes, we know that they are doing it, but because they are doing so much hangama about this lack of livelihood, that's why we allow them to do it. So for them, it is a very temporal thing. And they, both the parties have this understanding that it is temporal, and if needed, we might have to do away with it. So, like to the second question about people coming together, I have not seen much of people coming together to build the extensions, because each of these extensions was like an individual making of each unit or families, either for a livelihood or because of shelter, a gardening, a space for storage. So it is a question of their individual families' needs that are being met. But of course, lot of them are being built by the woman of the house. It is a lot of the initiatives and especially the livelihood, like a tailoring shop or anything which is being run under that shed, is being controlled and mobilized by the woman of the family. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a nice mix of topics that we have covered, covering things like ecology of the city and also for the city, covering things which are related to just the basic complex ecology of a city, its interaction between humans and animals, and also the urgency of climate coming in as well. So we have sort of set the cat amongst the pigeons in the urban context, and I think you'll have lots of interesting questions. Please interact with the panelists during lunch and later. So thank you all.